everyone, welcome to History Club. It's Mr. Jordan here, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War. The presentation is entitled Cold War, Red versus Red, White, and Blue. Stay tuned. The first thing to know about the Cold War is that it wasn't actually a war. It's a term we use for the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is a country you might not have ever heard of because it's a country that doesn't exist anymore. It was one big country made up of many smaller countries. But Russia, a country that's still around today, was the most important and dominant country in that group. So this rivalry, the Cold War, started at the end of World War II in 1945, and it lasted until the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Soviet Union was a communist country, which means they had a government-controlled economy, and the United States was a capitalist economy, which meant they had a free market economy. You may be wondering what made the Soviet Union communist to start with. And the answer is that it started at the end of World War I. During the war, Russia went broke with all the expenses of paying for the war. In fact, it didn't even have enough money to pay for guns for its soldiers, and civilians were going hungry. All this anger led to a revolt, and it started a revolution in which the Tsar, the leader of Russia, was overthrown. The royal family was executed, and Vladimir Lenin, who was a communist revolutionary, came to power. He became the leader, and that's what turned the government communist. The Red Scare is a term that's often used when talking about the Cold War, but the first Red Scare actually happened before the Cold War. You see, once Russia went to communism, the United States was afraid that it would spread to us, and red was the color that was usually used symbolically in communist flags, and that's where it gets its name from. In 1917, Russia turned communist and exited World War I, and that was the same year that the United States entered World War I. The United States was afraid communists would be disloyal to the war cause, so Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law in 1917 and 1918. These limited free speech and led to many protests, but they were upheld in the Supreme Court. The Tehran Conference was one of the conferences that directly led to the Cold War. These conferences were held at the end of World War II. German conquest had started World War II in Europe in 1939. The United States entered that war after being attacked at Pearl Harbor in 1941. That attack was led by the Japanese, and the Japanese, together with the Germans and Italians, formed the Axis Alliance. The United States formed an alliance with the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, and the leaders of those countries, the Allied countries, met at Tehran to discuss strategy in 1943, from November to December of that year. They also discussed the peace terms if they won. But one thing that was clear from the beginning was that the United Kingdom would no longer be the superpower it once was. The second of these meetings was in February 1945 in Yalta, in the Russian region known as Crimea. By then, the Allies were winning the war, and they began to discuss what they wanted the post-war world to look like. They wanted the unconditional surrender of Germany, and they agreed to divide Germany into 4 zones. Stalin, the leader of Russia at the time, made some agreements. He agreed with the United States that they would have free elections in Eastern Europe after the war, and that Russia would enter the war versus Japan as well. All these allies agreed that they would create a United Nations to help prevent future wars. From July to August of 1945, the third conference, the POTSDAM Conference, was held near Berlin. By then, the Allies had won the war in Europe. The German leader Adolf Hitler was dead, but unfortunately the American President Franklin Roosevelt had died as well. So Vice President Harry S. Truman took over to become president, and he was the one who attended this conference. Another change in leadership was that Winston Churchill was not re-elected as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So both he and the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, attended the Potsdam Conference. They discussed punishment and reparations for Germany, as well as the unconditional surrender from Japan. The United States and the USSR, or Soviet Union, were competing to be the first to invent the atomic bomb at this time. They hoped to use the bomb to end the war with Japan. The Soviet Union didn't keep its promise at Yalta to give Eastern Europe free elections. Instead, Eastern Europe got Soviet-influenced elections. The Iron Curtain is a term used to refer to the division in Europe at this time, with Western Europe being democratic governments and Eastern Europe being communist governments. The term comes from a speech that Winston Churchill gave at Harry S. Truman's invitation in the United States in 1946. During this speech, Churchill praised the United States as a world power, said that the United States and the United Kingdom had a very special friendship, and criticized the Soviet Union and its policies. This meant that the Cold War was now in full progress. So at Yalta, Germany was divided into zones controlled by the Allies. The western zones were controlled by the United Kingdom and the United States, and the eastern zones were controlled by the USSR. Berlin was in the eastern half, but the United States and the United Kingdom got a portion anyway because it was Germany's most important city. Now, the USSR wasn't exactly happy about that, and they attempted to prevent supplies from going into the western part of Berlin in 1948 and 1949. But Western Berlin got supplies through airlift. And what was worse for the USSR was that people were leaving the eastern half of Berlin for the western half. About 3 million people did that from 1949 to 1961. So the Soviets decided they would build a wall to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961, made of concrete blocks and barbed wire. Before, Berliners could move freely throughout the city, but now they could only cross at certain checkpoints, which were monitored by East German soldiers. Now, John F. Kennedy was now the president at this time, and he was not happy about this, even if it was better than war. He traveled to Berlin, and in West Berlin he made a speech in which he declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," or "I am a Berliner." Domino theory was the idea that if one nation fell to communism, other nations would fall too. For example, in Korea, the revolution split the country into North and South Korea. After North Korea fell, the United States was afraid South Korea would fall as well, and they fought a war against North Korea. And the exact same thing happened in Vietnam. Now let's discuss these two wars. Like Germany, Korea was split in two, with North Korea being communist and anti-communist in South Korea. The North invaded the South in June of 1950. The United Nations backed South Korea, and the United States went to war on their behalf. 16 countries sent troops to this war, and 41 sent supplies. China, which was also a communist country, backed North Korea, and the United States backed South Korea. Our armistice was finally signed in July 1953, and the North and South are still separate today, and there has never been a peace treaty signed in this war. The Vietnam War started before the United States ever got involved. It actually started as a war of independence, with Vietnam fighting for independence from its colonizer, France. Once independence was achieved, however, it became a civil war between communists in North Vietnam and anti-communists in South Vietnam. The United States gradually got involved, starting out only in an advisory role. So different start dates are given for the beginning of the war, but what is for sure is that the end was when Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to North Vietnam in 1975. Do you remember a little while ago I said that there was a first Red Scare that happened before the start of the Cold War? Well, there was a second Red Scare that happened near the beginning of the Cold War. This Red Scare is also known as McCarthyism, after Senator Joseph McCarthy. He claimed communists had infiltrated the U.S. government in the State Department and Army. People believed him because of anxieties over the communist takeover of China, the Korean War, and the conviction of Soviet spies. He was brought down by a new technology, television. When television hearings were broadcast, the public turned against him, and eventually his finances were called into question. Things were happening in Cuba as well. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over Cuba and turned it communist. Cuba also took over United States businesses there, such as sugar and oil. Cuba became close friends with the Soviet Union. The United States refused to trade with Cuba because of this and ended diplomatic relations. The CIA even trained Cuban exiles to invade the Bay of Pigs in 1961, but this operation failed. The Soviet Union agreed to send missiles to Cuba in 1961, and the U.S. ordered a naval blockade, which could have led to a nuclear war. Fortunately, the Soviet Union backed down and agreed not to send missiles there. But the United States privately agreed there would be no more invasions. The rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union wasn't just political or economic, but also scientific. Both wanted to be the first to explore outer space. The USSR was the first to launch a satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. The United States was worried it was falling behind, so it sent Ham the space chimp into space in 1961. But the Soviet Union was the first to send a person into space, with Yuri Gagarin later on in 1961. At that point, John F. Kennedy said that the U.S. would be the first to put a man on the moon, and they would do it by the end of the 1960s. Although it seemed impossible, and although he died before it happened, he was right. The United States sent Neil Armstrong to the moon in 1969. In 1972, President Richard Nixon made two diplomatic agreements. Remember how China was communist too? He agreed with China to increase diplomatic relations. Also, he agreed with the USSR to decrease the amount of weapons. Unfortunately, the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The US helped Afghanistan defend itself, and Soviet troops withdrew in 1989. That same year, the Berlin Wall was toppled, and East and West Germany were reunited the very next year in 1990. Also, this was at the same time that communist rule was ending in many Eastern European countries. Eventually, communists lost power in the Soviet Union itself, and several small countries broke away from the USSR in 1991, dissolving the Soviet Union and bringing about an end to the Cold War. In the picture, you'll see that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the end of its existence, are embracing. These two negotiated very often. Thanks for joining us for History Club today. I hope you learned something. I'll see you later. Goodbye.